There is a room at the center of the assembly where every world that matters keeps a chair, 10,000 chairs, give or take, arranged in rings that climb toward a ceiling. No one has ever bothered to light fully because the important business happens close to the floor. Most of the chairs are full. One has been empty for 1,000 years. And on the day this story begins, an old Ilsani named Sethra Vaughn stood up beside that empty chair and asked the assembly to please, for the love of every record, ever kept, leave it alone. They laughed at her, not cruelly. That was the part she would remember later, when there was time to remember things. They laughed the way you laugh at someone who has read too many old books and started to believe the dust. Sethra was an archivist counselor. She had spent 400 years with her hands in the deep files, the ones no one else opened. And she had come to the floor that day, holding a single thin volume called the Register of Silence. In it was written every session the human seat had gone unclaimed, 1,000 years of them. She read the number aloud slowly and asked them to hear what it meant. "It means the humans are gone," said the delegate from the Vorn ascendancy, and the room warmed to him. "It means a seat sat empty. So long the wood forgot who sat in it. We are not afraid of an empty chair. You should be Sethra," said. They laughed again. And the thing about dramatic irony is that everyone in the room was living inside it, and only one of them could feel the cold. Let me tell you about the chair, because you will need to understand it before the rest makes any sense at all. When the assembly first formed, long before the Vorn had ships worth the name, humanity took a seat like everyone else. Then, quietly, over a span of years no one had marked. At the time they stopped coming, no withdrawal, no speech, no var. They simply stopped sending anyone, and when asked why the last human envoy had said a sentence that got filed away and misunderstood for 1,000 years, she had said we would rather not be governed by a room. And then she had gone home, and the seat had stayed empty, and the galaxy had decided, the way a galaxy does, that silence meant weakness. The Vorn ascendancy had decided it more loudly than anyone. Warmaster Korthal Dross was not in the chamber that day. He was 3 jumps out, standing on the command deck of a warship the size of a small moon, looking at a map of the Meridian Corridor and thinking about how much of it he was going to own. The corridor was the reason for all of it. A long thread of dead space and quiet stations that connected 6 trade rings, and running straight through the middle of it on every old chart was a marker for a human colony that no one had heard from in generations. To Korthal, the marker was an insult, a thing taking up room. He had built his whole argument to the assembly around a single clean idea, and he liked to say it out loud because he liked the shape of it in his mouth. An empty seat is an empty world, he said to no one, to his own reflection in the deck glass. A species that never argues has nothing left to argue with. His flag captain, a nervous young officer who had read more history than was good for a career, said very carefully that the older files were not so certain about that. Korthal told him the older files were written by frightened archivists, and to plot the approach to Halden Station. Now, cut to Halden. Halden Station was one of those quiet stops in the corridor, a ring of old habitat rising over a rock, too small to have a name that anyone used. About 300 people lived there. They ran the relay, kept the docks warm for ships that almost never came and grew things. That last part was mostly one man's doing. Tomas Okafor was 51 years old and had the kind of hands that told you what he did before he told you himself. He ran the station's grow house, which was really just a long room of light and green under the outer hull, and he kept a seed vault beneath it that he was quietly, stubbornly proud of. 10,000 varieties, some of them from soil no human had walked on in centuries, all of them cataloged in his own crabbed handwriting, because he did not trust the systems to survive as long as paper. He had a daughter named Lena on a colony, 4 jumps away, a girl he had not held in 6 years, and he wrote to her the old way, on paper, in numbered letters, because once, long ago, one had gone missing, and she had cried on the comm, and he had promised her she would always know if one was lost. The evening, the assembly laughed at Sethra von Tomas, was sitting under the grow house lights, finishing letter 43. He told Lena about a tomato that had come up crooked and refused to die. He told her the light in the far bay had started to flicker and he'd been meaning to fix it for a month. He did not tell her he was tired, because you don't put that in a letter to your child. He sealed it, wrote the number on the outside, the way he always did, and set it on the shelf by the door to go out with the next relay. The next relay never came. What came instead was the Vorn back in the chamber. The vote was moving faster than Sethra could slow it. She tried once more. She stood small and old, among species twice her height, and she said that a seat is not empty, the way a hand is empty, that an empty hand is simply waiting. She said that in her 400 years in the files, she had learned exactly one thing worth the whole career, and it was this: the quietest thing in any room is usually the thing you have not yet made angry. The Vorn delegates smiled and called for the vote. They vacated the seat. It passed by a wide margin, the way most terrible decisions do, with a comfortable majority and a good lunch waiting. The human chair, empty 1,000 years, was formally struck from the ring, and the Meridian Corridor, with all its quiet stations and its one forgotten colony, was declared open to Ascendancy administration. Korthal Dross received the confirmation on his command deck and allowed himself a rare private smile. Sethra Vaughn did not go home that night. She went down into the files deeper than she had gone, in a century, into a section that had not been opened since before her own birth. She was looking for the rest of what the last human envoy had said, because she had a feeling, the specific cold feeling of an archivist who has just watched a room make a mistake, that the sentence had not ended where the record cut it off. It took her most of the night to find it. When she did, she sat very still for a long time, and then she began quietly to make copies. As many as she could. She did not fully know why yet. She only knew that some things need to survive. The people who ignore them. On his deck, Korthal gave the order to move into the corridor. First, stop Halden Station. A relay ring, 300 souls. No defenses worth the word. He expected to have it by morning and forget it by afternoon. And on Halden, Tomas Okafor woke to the sound the station made when something enormous slid into the dock that should not have fit, and he stood in the doorway of his grow house in the dark, looking at a shape in the far window that blotted out the stars. And the last ordinary thought he had, for a long while, was that he really should have fixed that flickering light. The seat was empty. Everyone in the galaxy agreed on that. They were about to spend a great deal of blood and time learning what the word had actually meant. Taking Halden Station was by every measure Korthal Dross cared about effortless. His boarding crews came through the docks before most of the station was awake. There was no fighting, because there was nothing to fight with. Halden had a relay ring, a grow house, a water plant, and 300 people who had spent their lives being useful to ships that passed, and never once imagined a ship that would stop and take them. By the time the sun side of the rock rolled into light, the Ascendancy had the whole station in hand, and Korthal had already moved on in his mind to the next marker in the corridor. He recorded a short message to the Assembly. Halden secured no losses administration underway. Then he made the decision that would eventually cost him everything, and he made it the way you make a decision that seems obvious at the time. He did not release the people of Halden. He held them, 300 civilians gathered in the largest dock, watched by a handful of bored soldiers. Leverage, his tactical officer, called it, if any human ship did come sniffing down the corridor, better to have something in hand. Korthal agreed. He thought of it as tidiness, not cruelty. That distinction would matter to no one but himself. Tomas Okafor was in that dock. They had pulled him out of the grow house in the dark, and he had asked in the calm way of a man who deals mostly with growing things whether someone could keep the far bay lights on, because the seedlings there were 4 days from a transplant and would not survive a cold cycle. The soldier who was holding him did not understand the words and would not have cared if he had. So Tomas stood in the crowd and did the only thing left to him, which was to worry about tomatoes, because worrying about the 300 people around him was too large to hold. He still had letter 43 in his coat pocket. He had grabbed it off the shelf on the way out, without deciding to. It sat there against his chest, sealed, numbered, undelivered, cut now to a room very far away, and much quieter. The humans did not learn about Halden the way you might expect. There was no dramatic alarm, no fleet scrambling. There was a room somewhere on a world that this story will never name, with a long table and a whiteboard that had a permanent marker stain in one corner from years ago that no one had ever cleaned. A handful of people sat around it drinking something warm. When the report came in that an Ascendancy War Master had entered the Meridian Corridor and taken Halden and was holding its people, the reaction in the room was not fury. It was a kind of quiet that a Vorn officer, had he seen, it would have found far more disturbing than any shouting. A woman named Anna Reyes read the report twice. She was the fleet coordinator for the corridor, which was a title that meant less than it sounded and more than anyone off Earth understood. She was not young. She had the steadiness of a person who has done a hard thing many times and stopped needing to talk about it. She set the report down, looked at the stain on the whiteboard for a moment as if it owed her money, and said, "Send the long quiet. Just her. Go get our people." Someone at the table asked if she wanted to send more. She said no. She said it the way you decline a second helping. And then she said, the thing that would weeks later be repeated across 100 worlds by people trying to explain what had happened. Though at the time it was only a small tired sentence in a small quiet room, she said, "We don't need a fleet to ask for something back that was already ours." The long quiet was one ship. She was old, and she did not look like much. And that was the point though. Only her own crew knew it. She turned into the Meridian Corridor alone and went to Halden without hurry. And she did not announce herself the way a warship does, with challenges and power readings meant to frighten. She simply arrived and hailed the station and asked to speak to whoever was in charge. On his deck, Korthal almost laughed. One ship, a single hull, unremarkable, sitting off his stolen station, like a delivery boat that had wandered into a war. He put the human on his screen, expecting a demand, a threat, the trembling defiance of the weak. What he got was Anna Reyes, sitting in an ordinary chair, looking mildly inconvenienced. "You're holding 300 people who grow food and keep a relay warm," she said. "We'd like them back, all of them unharmed, and the station intact. You can leave the way you came in, and we'll consider it a misunderstanding." Korthal studied her. He was good at reading fear, and he could not find any, and that bothered him more than he let it show. So he did what men like Korthal do when the shape of a thing does not fit their idea of it. He pressed on the idea instead. "You come alone," he said, "to a warship, and you make demands. Where is your fleet, human? How many ships does Earth have?" She looked at him for a moment, and it was not a hostile look. And that was the worst part. It was the look of someone deciding how much of the truth a child is ready for. "Enough," she said, and she left it there. Just that. Enough. No number. No boast. Korthal had spent his life in a galaxy that measured everything that answered strength, with a count of hulls. And here was a woman declining to play the game at all, as if the game were beneath the answer. He told her the people of Halden were now Ascendancy, administrative wards, and their status would be reviewed in due process. He told her one ship was welcome to sit in the corridor and watch. Then he cut the channel, because he wanted to be the one who ended it. The long quiet did not leave. She held her position off Halden patient as a stone, and did nothing, which it turned out was a great deal harder to ignore than something. Now cut back to the files, and to Sethra Vaughn, who had not slept. She had found the rest of the envoy's sentence. It had taken her all night, in a section of the deep record sealed so long. The access itself had left a mark on the log that someone eventually would notice. The last human envoy 1,000 years ago had not simply said we would rather not be governed by a room. The record had cut her off there because the clerk of the day had found the rest unimportant. What she had actually said in full was this: we would rather not be governed by a room, because we have already learned, at a cost, we will not describe to you, that we cannot be. Please do not mistake our leaving for our absence. We are not absent. We are simply not asking. Sethra read it 4 times. Then she pulled the thread further into the records. The humans themselves had lodged, and no one had ever bothered to read. And she began to understand something that made her hands go still on the desk. The empty seat had never been a species fading away. It had been a decision, a door left, standing open on purpose for 1,000 years, so that everyone could see it was not locked. The humans had not hidden. They had stood in plain view the entire time, unclaimed and unbothered, waiting to find out who would eventually be foolish enough to read an open door as an empty house. She thought of the vote, she thought of Corthal Dross, and his clean little sentence about empty seats, and she reached for a channel to warn him, and stopped, because she already knew he would not hear it. So instead, she did the archivist's thing, the only power she had ever really had. She kept copying. She copied the envoy's full words, and the human records, and the register of silence, and she sent them quietly to every delegate who might one day need to have known. Out in the corridor, the standoff held. Corthal's fleet vast and certain ringed a stolen station. One old human ship sat and watched and asked for nothing further, and in the dock among 300 frightened people, Tomas Okafor kept one hand pressed to the letter in his coat and told a woman beside him, in a low, steady voice, that it was going to be all right, that ships like the little one out the window did not sit still unless they meant to stay, and that, in his experience, the quietest thing in the room was usually the last thing you should be afraid of. He was half right. It was going to be a great deal of things before it was all right, but he had the quiet part exactly correct, and he did not even know why. Corthal, watching the unmoving human ship from his deck, felt for the first time the smallest thread of something he had no name for. He decided it was impatience. He gave the order to run a show of force, to remind the little ship, and everyone watching, just how small it truly was. That was the first flex. It did not go the way he expected, but that is the next part of the story. The show of force was meant to be simple. Corthal Dross had done it 100 times. You bring a warship's weapons to full readiness, loud and visible. You paint the small ship with everything you have, and you let the fear do the work no shot ever needs to. It was theater, and Corthal was good at theater. He ordered it against the long quiet, the way you swat at a fly, expecting the little hull to flinch, to back off, to remember its size. The long quiet did not flinch. She let herself be painted, sat calmly under the weight of a warship's full attention, and then without any drama at all, she simply stopped being where the weapons were pointed. Not by running, by adapting. Somewhere in the hours since she had arrived, her crew had watched the Ascendancy's targeting patterns, learned their rhythm, and rewritten their own systems to slip through the gaps. When Corthal's officers tried to hold a lock, the lock would not hold. It was like trying to pin a shadow to a wall. Every time they adjusted, the human ship had already adjusted first an hour ago quietly, while they were still congratulating themselves on the last adjustment. Corthal's tactical officer reported this in the flat voice of a man who does not want to be the one saying it. The War Master told him to stop making excuses and hold the lock. The officer said with great care that the ship did not seem to be evading so much as declining, as if being targeted were a suggestion the humans had considered and turned down. That was when the first real crack ran through Corthal's certainty, and to cover it, he did what proud men do. He got louder. "It is one ship," he said, "one old ship, and a species so weak, it let a chair sit empty for 1,000 years. The seat is empty. Remember that an empty seat is an empty world." The words did not warm him this time, the way they had on the deck glass a week ago. He noticed that, and he chose not to notice that he had noticed. Cut to the corridor itself, to the long dead spaces between the trade rings, the parts of the map that everyone had always treated as nothing. The Meridian corridor was dotted with old stations like Halden, relay stops, waypoints, a scattering of habitats that the charts marked as abandoned or barely manned, the leftovers of an older age of traffic. Corthal had flown past dozens of them on his way in and spared them not a single thought, because a dead station is a dead station. They were not dead. They had never been dead. They had been quiet, which in this story is a very different thing. And on a signal that no Ascendancy sensor was tuned to catch, 40 of them woke up at once, not with weapons. That is the part that matters. The part Sethra Vaughn would later underline 3 times in her records. They woke, as what they had always secretly been yards, building yards. Each of those forgotten waypoints was a place where humans made things patiently out of the way, and 40 of them opened their doors along the corridor and let out what they had been holding. 40 ships slid into the dark between Corthal and the trade rings behind him, not a hidden battle fleet dispatched from Earth. Something stranger and worse, for a man like Corthal to understand. These ships had been built right there in the empty places he had flown past in the quiet he had mistaken for absence, and they had been finished, not in some distant shipyard years ago, but recently, quickly, faster than his own people could have managed with all their industry, as if the humans could simply decide to have more and then have them. His flag captain, the one who read too much history, brought him the count and could not keep the awe out of his voice. 40 ships, War Master, from stations. We logged as derelict. Where did they come from? Corthal stared at the plot, at the 40 new markers threaded quietly across his line home, and asked the only question his kind of mind knew how to ask. How many do they have? How many ships does Earth have? No one could tell him, because the answer was not a number you could hold still. The answer was a rate. Now cut to Sethra Vaughn, who had stopped copying files and started making calls. She reached Corthal directly. It took every scrap of rank she had left, but she got a channel to his deck, and she did not waste it. She had spent 400 years being ignored gently, and she had no interest in being ignored gently one more time. War Master, she said, listen to me, because I am the only one in this whole assembly who read the door before you kicked it. The humans did not fade. They chose to leave the room. That empty seat you struck from the ring was not weakness. It was a message 1,000 years long, and it said plainly to anyone patient enough to read it, we do not need you, we do not fear you, and we would rather you never had a reason to test which of those keeps you safe. You have now given them the reason. Give back the people. Leave the corridor. There is still a version of tomorrow where the ascendancy survives what it started, and it is closing while I speak. Corthal looked at the old Ilsani on his screen, small and gray and utterly certain, and he felt the thread of fear again, and he hated her for it. So he did the thing men do to the person who names the fear. He made her the fool. You have read too many old books, Archivist, he said. You smell ghosts in every empty room. 40 ships is not an empire. 40 ships is a gesture. I have thousands. And he cut the channel because, again, he wanted to be the one who ended it, and he was beginning to need that small victory more than he would ever admit. Sethra sat back in the dark of the files. She did not try again. There is a specific grief an archivist feels watching a person walk into a mistake that is already written down somewhere, and she let herself feel it for exactly as long as it took to breathe, and then she went back to copying, because the record would survive him, even if he would not survive the record. Out in the corridor, the humans made one more move, and it was the quietest and the loudest thing yet. The long quiet hailed Corthal. Not Anarea's this time. Or not only her. It was a general transmission sent to his whole fleet, and though he did not know it yet, to every ascendancy channel that would carry it, and a good many that would not. It was short. Anareas in her ordinary chair said that they had asked once politely for their people back and been refused. She said they would ask one more time, and then they would stop asking, because asking is a thing you do with people who might say yes. Then, she said the humans were going to start the clock. She did not explain what the clock was. She did not have to. On every ascendancy screen, a count began. Not a countdown ticking towards zero the way a threat does. A count up, a number climbing slowly, patiently from 1, and no one on Corthal's side could tell what it was counting or where it would stop, and that not knowing crawled into the fleet like cold water. His officers watched the number rise and asked each other in low voices, what happens when it gets high enough? No one knew. That was the genius of it. A countdown tells you how long you have. A count-up tells you only that something is being tallied and that someone somewhere will decide when the total is enough. On Halden in the dock, Thomas Okafor did not see the count, but he felt the change in the soldiers guarding them, the new tightness, the way they stopped being bored. He took letter 43 out of his pocket, looked at the number he had written on it in his own hand, and thought, without knowing how right he was, that everything worth anything gets counted. Eventually, he put the letter back. He told the woman beside him to keep her strength up, that the little ship was still out there, and that ships that start counting have already decided how the story ends. Corthal Draw stood on his deck and watched a number climb, and refused with everything he had to be afraid of arithmetic. That refusal was the last free choice he got to make. What came next was not theater. and it did not care what he refused to feel. Corthal Dross made his choice, and he made it out of pride, which is the most expensive material in the galaxy. The Count was climbing. His officers were quiet in the way that spreads, and somewhere under the certainty he had worn his whole life, a colder man was beginning to do the math. So Corthal reached for the one card he was sure the humans could not answer. He opened a channel to the long quiet, and he put the people of Halden on it. 300 of them gathered in the dock, visible, frightened alive. He let Ana Reyes see them. Then he told her the terms. The little ship and its 40 friends would withdraw from the corridor. The Assembly's vacating of the human seat would stand, and the Ascendancy would keep Halden and its wards as a guarantee of good behavior. Refuse, he said, and the ward's status would be reviewed less kindly. He expected her to break. He had built his whole life on the reliable fact that showing a person, their loved ones, in your hand makes them do what you want. Ana Reyes looked at the 300 faces on her screen for a long moment. Then she looked past them to the man holding them, and she said something that Corthal would carry to the end of his days. We see them, she said. We see every one of them. That's the difference between us that you still don't understand. You look at those people, and you see leverage. We look at them, and we see the reason we came. She paused. You just told 300 people they're bargaining chips on an open channel where they can hear you. Some of them are standing right next to your soldiers. I want you to remember that you did that. And then she stopped asking. What happened next happened fast. And it was not what Corthal had braced for. He had prepared himself for a fleet, for a great crashing wave of human ships, for the honest arithmetic of hull against hull, which was a language he spoke and half hoped for, because a battle he could lose was still a battle he understood. That is not what he got. The humans did not come to fight his fleet. They came to take it apart. The 40 ships that had woken in the corridor moved with a coordination that had no seam in it, and the long quiet moved with them. And they went through the Ascendancy formation, not like an army, but like a crew disassembling a machine. They had studied for a week. They knew where every weapon on every Vorn hull was mounted because they had watched and adapted and learned. And while Corthal was busy making threats, his enemy had been quietly building a map of exactly how to make his fleet harmless, without making it a graveyard. Engines went dark. Weapon mounts came apart at the joints. Whole warships found themselves suddenly deaf and blind and drifting their crews unheard inside hulls that would not answer. It was surgical, and it was total, and it was somehow worse than slaughter, because slaughter, at least, would have told Corthal his enemy was capable of the same ugliness. This told him nothing of the kind. This told him they simply did not need to. And as it happened, the number he had been afraid to fear became a number he could no longer avoid. His flag captain gave it to him in pieces, because that was the only way it would fit in the mouth. The 40 ships in the corridor were not 40. They had been the doorway. Behind them, threading in from the quiet places, from waypoints and dead stations, and the long dark between the rings came more, and the Count, his sensors kept trying to fix, would not stop climbing 400, then past it, then a number in the thousands that the young officer read aloud, and then read again because he did not believe it the first time. And still, none of it looked like a hidden armada scrambled from Earth. Every ship carried the marks of a different yard, a different quiet corner of the corridor, built at a different hour. They had not been waiting in a fleet. They had been made continuously everywhere. Faster than the Ascendancy could have destroyed them, faster than Corthal could lose them. He finally understood the answer to his own question, the one he had asked, the old Ilsani, the one he had asked his officers, the one that had no number. How many ships does Earth have? The humans had never answered it because it was the wrong question. The right question was, how fast can they make more? And the answer to that was faster than you can take them away. You could not win a war of attrition against people who treated attrition as a manufacturing schedule. Every ship he unmade, they would outbuild before he had finished celebrating. The empty places he had flown past without a thought had not been the edges of a dying civilization. They had been its workshop, running the whole time in plain sight. Patient as a seed vault, waiting for a reason, Corthal stood on a command deck that was going dark around him and watched a number he could not stop, and he heard himself say quietly to no one, the way he had said it once to the deck glass, "The seat is empty." Only now, the words had no strength in them at all. Now they sounded like a man reading his own sentence. "No, War Master," his flag captain said very softly, because someone finally had to. It was never empty. It was open. "There is a difference, and we have just walked through it." Korthal did not answer. Out beyond the glass, past the drifting silent shapes of his own warships, the little ship called the Long Quiet was already turning toward Halden, toward the dock, toward 300 people, and one man, with a numbered letter in his coat. She was going to get them the way Anna Reyes had said, from the start plainly, before any of this, back when Korthal still thought an empty chair was an empty world. The Long Quiet came to Halden and took it back the way she did everything. Without spectacle, her people went through the station fast and quiet, and the handful of Ascendancy soldiers left holding the dock found their weapons useless, and their ship gone silent behind them, and made the only reasonable choice, which was to sit down and let it happen. No one on the human side went in shooting. Anna Reyes had been clear. "We are here for 300 people. We do not add to the pile of the taken." Most of the 300 walked out, not all of them. This is the part that must be said plainly, because the story would be a lie if it were pretty here. When the Ascendancy had first come through the dock, in the dark, in those first loud minutes, when no one yet understood what was happening, some of the people of Halden had not made it into the crowd that became the leverage. A cold cycle had gone through the far sections, when the station's systems were seized. A few had been moved separately to other ships before the standoff even began, because Korthal's officers were tidy, and leverage is easier to manage in smaller groups. When the humans counted the people they carried out of Halden against the station's own roster, the numbers did not match, and everyone in that dock understood what a gap in a roster means, without anyone having to say it. Tomas Okafor was one of the ones who did not walk out. He had been moved on the second day, with a small group, to one of the warships, now drifting dark in the corridor, and in the confusion of a fleet coming apart. No one had thought to say where. He was not dead. The record would never be able to tell Lena that her father died on such a day, at such an hour, cleanly with a stone she could visit. He was simply among the taken on a ship that had gone silent in the vast administrative shrug of an empire that had catalogued him as a ward and then lost the catalog. That is its own kind of violation, the quiet kind, the kind that leaves a chair at a table and a light still on in a far bay, and a letter numbered 43 sitting where a man set it down and no clean ending anywhere in it. They found the letter. A human recovery crew sweeping the grow house found letter 43 on the shelf by the door where Tomas had left it. The night the ships came, and beside it in a battered case, the ledger of 10,000 seeds in his own crabbed hand. They did not know whose they were yet. They carried them out carefully. Anyway, because that is a thing humans do. And the letter went into the record. And the record is how any of us know his name at all. Now, cut one more time to Korthal Dross on his dark and dying deck, because his part of this act is not the battle. It is what he found while his fleet drifted and his certainty drained out of him. Korthal had his people pull whatever they could from Halden's seized systems before they lost access entirely. Some instinct in him, still reaching for information, the way a falling man reaches for a rail, and in the station's archive, filed with a care that stopped him cold, he found them, letters, numbered, dozens of them copies, kept in the station log, the way small isolated places keep everything going. Back years. Letter 1, Letter 12, Letter 30, Letter 43, dated the night before he arrived. All of them from the same man, Tomas Okafor, station archivist, to a daughter named Lena. 4 jumps away. Korthal read one. He did not mean to. It was letter 31, and it was about a light that had gone out in a far bay, and a promise to fix it, and a crooked tomato. And it ended with a line about how she should eat properly, and not stay up reading, which was a thing. Father says, and Korthal Dross, War Master of the Vorn Ascendancy, sat on the deck of his ruined flagship, and understood all at once, and far too late, what the count-up had been counting. It had never been counting his ships. It had been counting these. Every letter a man on a stolen station had written to his child. Every ordinary day the humans were tallying while his fleet argued about hulls. The number climbing on his screens had been the wrong number to watch the entire time. The right number was 43. And then it was however. Many letters would never now be written. And he had made that second number with his own tidy hands when he decided 300 people were leverage. His flag captain found him there and said nothing because there was nothing. The channel opened one last time in that act. And it was Anna Reyes, and she was not gloating, which was somehow the hardest part for Corthal to bear. She had the ledger and the letters in front of her. She had the roster gap. And she said in the same tired, ordinary voice she had used from the very first hail, "You took people who grow food and write to their children. We are sending your soldiers home to theirs. Those are not the same choice. And I want you to be very clear that it was a choice made by us on purpose, while you still had thousands of us in the dark on your ships. We could make you understand loss the way you made us. We are choosing not to. Sit with that. It's going to cost you more than any battle." She closed the channel. Corthal Dross was left with his silent fleet, his intact crews, his life and letter, 31 still open in front of him, a light in a far bay that a good man had meant to fix, and the slow arrival of the understanding that mercy real, or mercy from someone who had every reason to withhold it, is the heaviest thing a proud man can be handed. The seat was empty. He finally knew what that had meant. It was going to cost him everything to explain it to the people who had sent him. Corthal Dross came back to the assembly, a different shape than the man who had left it. They had to tow most of his fleet home. That was the first thing everyone noticed, thousands of intact warships being pulled back through the corridor by their own tugs, because not one of them could move on its own. Their crews alive and unharmed and utterly humiliated inside hulls that would not answer a single command. An empire can survive a massacre. A massacre gives it martyrs, and a story, and a reason to build again. What Corthal brought home was worse. He brought home proof that the humans had held every one of his people in the dark in the palm of their hand, and had simply chosen to open the hand. There is no monument you can build to that. There is no speech that makes it heroic. It just sits in the middle of a civilization like a stone. No one can lift, and everyone who walks past it understands. He stood on the floor of the assembly in the ring of 10,000 chairs, and he made his report, and his voice was not the voice that had called an empty seat, an empty world. The delegates listened. The Vorn delegation, so loud a few weeks ago, said very little, and when Corthal was done, when he had laid it all out, the 40 yards that were not derelict, and the count that would not stop, and the surgical unmaking of his fleet, and the 300 people, and the letters, a silence came over the chamber that was different from the polite silence of 1,000 ordinary sessions. It was the silence of a room realizing it had been wrong about something for a very long time, and that the wrongness had a cost that was still being counted. Into that silence, Sethra Vaughn stood up. She was not supposed to have the floor. She took it anyway, small and gray beside a chair that was no longer even in the ring, and she opened the register of silence, and she read the number again. 1,000 years of empty sessions, the same number she had read the day they laughed at her. No one laughed this time. You all believed the same thing, she said, and she was not angry, which made it land harder. You believed that a seat sitting empty for 1,000 years meant a people who had faded, or fled, or forgotten how to matter. I stood here and told you it was a message, and you called it dust. So let me tell you now what the message said in full, because I have read it, and it is the only thing in these files worth reading twice. She read the envoy's words, the whole sentence, the one that had been cut short in the record for 1,000 years. We would rather not be governed by a room because we have already learned at a cost we will not describe to you that we cannot be. Please do not mistake our leaving for our absence. We are not absent. We are simply not asking. Then she closed the book, and she said the thing that would be quoted for a long time afterward, on 100 worlds, by people who had never met her. An empty chair is not an empty hand. You looked at a door that a people had left standing open on purpose for 1,000 years, so that anyone could see it was not locked, and you decided that meant no one was home. You were wrong. In the most expensive way, it is possible to be wrong. They were home the entire time. They were simply not asking your permission to exist. And here is what none of you understood, what I did not fully understand until I watched a war master tow his whole fleet home in chains of its own silence. She paused, and she let the room lean in, because she had been ignored for 400 years, and she knew finally that she would not be ignored now. Humans are not dangerous because they are strong. Any fool can be strong. They are dangerous because they decided a very long time ago that no one gets to decide for them. And a species that has truly decided that all the way down in the marrow is not a thing you conquer. It is a thing you survive if they let you. No one answered her. There was no answer. Now cut to the humans one more time, because the reckoning was not only the enemy, understanding, it was what the humans did with the understanding, which was the part that broke the assembly open. The obvious move any empire in the ring would have made was to take the seat. The humans had just proven in front of everyone that they could unmake the strongest fleet in the corridor without spilling the blood inside it. A people who could do that could walk into the assembly and name their price. Take the human chair back with ceremony demand. The Vorn ascendancy be dissolved, install themselves at the head of the ring, and be obeyed. It was theirs to take. Everyone in the chamber braced for it. Some of them quietly had already started composing the speeches of congratulation they would give to their new masters, because that is how the ring had always worked, and no one imagined it worked any other way. Anna Reyes appeared on the assembly floor by transmission, sitting in the same ordinary chair, in front of the same whiteboard, with the same stain in the corner, and she declined all of it. She did not want the seat. She said so plainly, and she had to say it twice, because the first time the room did not understand the words. Earth would not be reclaiming its chair in the ring. Earth would not be administering the Meridian Corridor. Earth would not be dissolving the Vorn ascendancy, or occupying its worlds, or demanding tribute, or seating a single human in a single position of power over a single Vorn life. The seat, she said, would stay exactly as it had been for 1,000 years. Empty, open, unlocked. You seem to think we came for the chair, she said, to the ring of 10,000 delegates, and there was something almost gentle in it, the way you are gentle with people who have badly misread you. We never wanted the chair, we left it on purpose, and we're going to keep leaving it, because the whole point of the empty seat was to show you that we don't need to sit in your room to be free of it. If we took the chair now, we'd be admitting the chair was worth taking. It isn't. It never was. What's worth anything is that 300 people grow food and write letters, and some of them are home now, and some of them aren't, and no council in this ring gets a vote on which of us gets to matter. And then came the mercy that was larger than the battle, the one that would keep the assembly awake at night, far longer than any threat. The humans asked for nothing, not reparations, not a trial for Corthel Dross, not the dismantling of the fleet. They had already dismantled, and then handed back. They asked only that the Vorn go home, and that the people still unaccounted for from Halden be searched for honestly, and returned if they lived. That was all. A people who had every right to take an empire's throat in their hand, looked at the throat and let it go, and asked in exchange only that the empire go find the ones it had lost in its own dark, and bring them home. It is very hard to hate someone who does that. It is even harder to feel superior to them. The Vorn ascendancy, which had come to the corridor to prove that an empty seat was an empty world, was sent home, not in defeat exactly, but in something heavier, in the full knowledge that they had been utterly at the mercy of a people they had insulted, and that the people had shrugged and let them live and gone back to gardening. You can rebuild after a defeat. It is much harder to rebuild after being forgiven by someone you tried to erase. Sethra Vaughn updated the register that night. She did not strike the human seat back into the ring because the humans had asked her not to. She wrote instead a new line beneath the 1,000 years of empty sessions, and the line said only that the seat remained open by the choice of those it belonged to, and that the assembly now understood at last what open meant. Then she sat for a while, in the quiet of the files, an old archivist who had been right and had taken no pleasure in it, and she thought about the man in the letters, Thomas Okafor, whose name she had entered into the record herself, and whose chair at a small table on a stolen station was as far as anyone could yet say still empty, because that is where the reckoning finally came to rest, not on the assembly floor, not on Corthal's ruined deck, It came to rest in a grow house on Halden Station in a long room of light and green, under the outer hull where a human recovery team walked the rows Tomas had planted, and found the far bay lights still flickering, the ones he had meant to fix, the ones he had written to his daughter about the night before the ships came. The seedlings there had gone through a cold cycle with no one to save them. Most had not survived it. The room was quieter than a room full of growing things should ever be, and on the shelf by the door sat letter 43, numbered, in a careful hand, sealed, addressed to a colony, 4 jumps away, and never sent. Someone picked it up. Someone always does in the end. And they carried it out into the light to see that it got where it was going, because a letter with a number on it is a promise. And the humans, whatever else the galaxy had decided about them, over 1,000 quiet years, were a people who kept the promise that no letter would ever go missing. The count was almost finished. There was only one number left to deliver. The letter reached Lena Okafor on an ordinary afternoon, 4 jumps from anywhere, on a colony where the light came in low and gold, through a window she had been meaning to clean. It came the old way on paper, carried the last stretch by a person rather than a signal, because that was how her father had always sent them. And someone along the chain had understood that it mattered. She knew what it was before she opened it. She saw the number on the outside, first written in the careful crabbed hand. She would have known anywhere, and her breath caught, because she had counted too. All these years, quietly, the way children count the things. A parent promises will keep coming. The last one had been 42. This one said 43. She sat down with it. She did not open it right away. There is a moment when you are holding the last of something, and you know it is the last where you stay very still, because the not yet reading is the final stretch of time in which the person is still simply away, and not yet gone. She let herself have that moment. Then she opened letter 43, and she read about a tomato that had come up crooked and refused to die, and a light in a far bay that he had been meaning to fix, and a line at the end telling her to eat properly and not stay up reading. And she stayed up reading anyway, all night, all 43 of them from the beginning, because that was the only way left to be in the same room with him. That was the count. That was what it had been counting the whole time, under all the ships and all the fear from the first letter to the last. Not hulls, not power, just a man writing to his daughter, tallying the ordinary days, keeping a promise that none of them would go missing. The Vorn had watched the wrong number climb on their screens and never once understood that the real one was this small and this large. 43 letters. And now no more. That is the whole weight of it, and it does not need a bigger word. On Halden Station, in the grow house, the humans who stayed to set things right did the small work first, because the small work is how people carry the large grief. They fixed the light in the far bay. It took someone about an hour, and in the seed vault, beneath the grow house, in the ledger of 10,000 varieties, written in Tomas Okafor's own hand, they found the crooked tomato, the one he had written about, saved and labeled and set aside the way he had saved everything, and they planted it, not as a monument. He would have hated a monument. They planted it because it was a seed, and seeds are for planting. And a few weeks later, under the far bay light that worked now, it came up, crooked, and refused to die. Cut one last time to Sethravan and the Register of Silence. She was very old, now older in the way that comes from being right, about something you wish you had been wrong about. She kept her post in the deep files, and she kept the register, and the human seat stayed exactly where the humans had asked it to stay. Empty, open. The delegates who walked past it in the ring did not laugh at it anymore. They did not quite look at it either. They walked a little wider around it, the way you walk around a thing you have finally learned to respect. And the emptiness of that chair said more to them every single session than any occupied seat in the whole ring, because the phrase had turned all the way over now. At the start of all this, an empty seat is an empty world, had been a boast, a small clean sentence. A war master liked the taste of. By the end, it meant its exact opposite, and everyone in the assembly understood the new meaning without anyone having to teach it. The seat was empty because the people it belonged to did not need it. That was the whole terror. and the whole dignity of the thing. An empty chair kept empty on purpose, in plain view, for 1,000 years, by a people telling the galaxy, as plainly as they knew, how we are not asking. We were never asking. And the wisest thing you can do now, that you finally understand that, is to never again make us explain it. Sethra wrote one more line in the register near the end of her service, and then she closed the book for the last time and left it for whoever came after. Empires do not fall the way trees fall, she had said once to a room that was not listening. They fall the way a lie falls all at once, the moment the last person who believed it stops. The Vorn ascendancy did not fall in the end. It survived, but the lie, it had been built on the comfortable old lie that quiet means weak and empty means gone, that one fell completely, and it took with it a certain kind of arrogance that the whole ring had shared for 1,000 years, and the galaxy was quieter afterward, and a little more careful, and it did not entirely know why. And Korthal Dross, he lived. That was the mercy, and that was the sentence, the two being the same thing. He was not tried. The humans had asked for no trial, and their not asking was heavier than any punishment the Assembly could have devised. He went home to a people who could not quite meet his eye, not because he had lost a battle, but because he had been the one holding the hand that let them all live, and had felt it open, and had come home to tell them about it. He spent the rest of his years, they say in the archives of his own people, reading old records. The kind, frightened archivists write, looking perhaps for the next open door before someone else kicked it so that he might be the one this time to say, "Leave it alone." The story ends where these stories should end, which is with an ordinary person, going back to work. On Halden Station, the relay came back online, and the docks were warmed again for ships that almost never came, and the 300 minus the ones the dark had kept went back to their lives, because that is what living people do. And in the grow house, under a light that worked, now a young man who had taken over the rows knelt in the green and checked the crooked tomato and made a note in the ledger in his own hand beneath all of Tommaso Okafor's careful entries, and did not think about empires or seats or fleets at all. He thought about water and about light and about the next thing that needed doing. He straightened the stake beside the crooked plant so it could grow the way it wanted to grow. Then he stood and wiped his hands and went to fix the next thing on the list, because there is always a next thing, and the quiet work of keeping the light on is the whole of what humanity had ever been trying to tell them. The seat stayed empty. Everyone finally understood why